Old man Jin Collins sat precariously on the old fence as he slowly turned the quid of tobacco in his cheek, and, lifting his voice, he spoke with a mountaineer drawl. "Well, if he can take the certificate, it's the most he can do. On account of he ain't never gonna get that blue ribbon in his life as long as I'm around, just as sure as you're born a sinner." Then Jink relapsed into silence. His long legs dangled dejectedly among the roadside weeds. His brown jean trousers, that had despaired of ever reaching his ankles, were ornamented here and there with ill-adjusted patches, and his loose-fitting coat was out at his elbows. An old faithful hat drooped over his eyes, which was fixed absently on the distant blue mountain ranges that melted tenderly into the blue of the midday sun and framed the exquisite mosaic of fields in the valley, far, far below the grim gray crag on which his little home was perched. Despite his long legs, he was a lightweight, or he wouldn't have chosen as his favorite seat so rickety a fence. Jacob Lawson, the other participant in this meeting of the minds, was a heavier man, and he apparently had some doubts as to the sturdiness of the old fence, as he leaned only slightly against one of its projecting rails while he whittled a pine stick, and with his every movement the frail structure trembled. In the distance, Jink's log cabin seemed as wore out as the fence. The little front porch had lost a board here and there in the flooring, perhaps on some cold winter night when Jink's energy was not sufficiently exuberant enough to convey him to the cold wood pile, so he might borrow a plank from the porch floor. Through the open door, you could see a few split-bottomed chairs, a bedstead with a patchwork calico quilt, with its mattress sagging in the center. Above it, there were strings of bright red peppers hanging from the dark rafters, and across the room was a passel of grave-faced, barefoot children, occupying almost an entire side of the room. Notwithstanding the poverty of the cabin and the evident sloth as its master, it was characterized by a scrupulous cleanliness. The rough floor was not only swept, but scoured, and those dark rafters, whence depended the flaming banners of the red pepper, they harbored no cobwebs, and the faces of the numerous children bore no more dirt than was consistent with their recent occupation of making mud pies. And the bald-headed baby, lying silently but wide awake in the old wooden cradle, was as clean as clear spring water and yellow soap could make it. But today, there was serious business at hand on the Jin Collins home place. That's right, between the rural folks of Morgan County and those city slickers in nearby Wartburg, there existed a bitter and deeply rooted animosity that manifested itself at conventions and elections, with the rural folks voting as a unit against any of Wartburg's candidates. And because of this, anytime there was a public meeting, especially a county fair, those city folks set out to outdo those country boys every time. The prize offered this year for the best rider was, as it happened, a new feature, and it drew a special interest. Oh, the country's blood was up. Here was something for which they could fairly compete. Hence, the leader of the rural faction, Squire Goodlet, a man who had lived in the narrow valley between the town folk and the mountaineers, had sent word that he was willing to loan his best horse and saddle to Jin Collins, a man whose famous riding was known far and wide amongst the folks of Windrock Mountain. And in the present, complacent as ever, Jinx sat upon the rickety fence at home as he casually disparaged the equestrian accomplishments of the town's noted champion. Quivering with concern, young Jacob Lawson brought the news of Squire's offer of a horse and a saddle to Jinx if he would only go down to Wartburg and beat those town fellas out on their own ground. But even with the best horse, Jacob was doubtful about Jinx's chances against this city slicker. "Well, I don't know," said Jacob. "That Hackett fella sits mighty firm in his saddle, and he's as straight as any shingle and as tough as a pine knot. He come up here last summer with some of them there Petros boys, a bear hunting and a deer hunting and one thing or another. I seen him a time or two up in the woods, and he can ride just as good amongst those gullies and ridges like he'd been born in these hills. He ain't gonna be easy to beat." "Oh, it don't make nary bit of difference," retorted Jink. "He'll never get that blue ribbon as long as I'm able to ride. That certificate's as good a plenty for the type of riding he can do." Doubt was still expressed on the face of Jacob, but he said no more. And after a short silence, Jin Collins slumped down from the fence and walked on his way down the dusty road. Jacob still stood leaning against the rails and whittling upon his pine stick, and he was in no way angered or dismayed by his host's unceremonious departure, for social etiquette wasn't very rigid on Windrock Mountain. Truth is, Jacob himself was an up-and-coming rider who had been itching for his opportunity to make a name for himself in this small mountain hamlet. Just then, Cynthia Collins stepped into the doorway of the cabin in the distance. She was robed like September in a brilliant yellow. She had slumberous dark eyes and curling tendrils of brown hair. She held in her hand a string of red pepper, to which she was adding some newly gathered pods. She took no more notice of Jacob than he accorded to her, and there they stood, within 12 feet of one another, in utter silence. And to all appearance, each was entirely unconscious of the other's existence. Jacob whittling on his pine stick, and Cynthia slowly stringing together the pods of red pepper. And after several awkward moments, Jacob was the first to speak. "Cynthia," he said at length, without raising his eyes or turning his head. Yet Cynthia didn't answer. But for some reason, Jacob knew without looking up that she had fixed those slumberous brown eyes upon him, waiting for him to go on. "Cynthia," he spoke again, "ain't you ever thinking about getting married?" He cast a laughing glance towards her and looked down quickly at his pocket knife and the stick he was busy whittling. But by now, it was growing very slender. Cynthia's serious face relaxed.
"You're plumb foolish, Jacob,"
she said, after stringing on another pepper pod with great deliberation.
"If I were studying about getting married, there ain't nobody around here that I'd have."
And then she added another pod to the flaming red string of peppers. Jacob's whittling stick, he couldn't escape annihilation for much longer, as his pocket knife moved vigorously through its fibers. "Wait a minute, gal. You talk like I was going to ask you to marry me, but I ain't, though." The stick was now a shaven, and it fell among the weeds. So Jacob shut his pocket knife with a snap, shouldered his gun, and without a word of ado from either side, the conference terminated. And then he walked off down the sandy road. Cynthia stood watching him until the laurel bushes hid him from her sight. Then, sliding down from the door frame to the step, she sat motionless, a bright-hued mass of yellow draperies and red peppers, her slumberous deep eyes resting on the leaves that had closed upon him. And silently, she wondered how long it would be again before she saw Jacob. After all, he was the object of her secret desires.
Get someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 2 volumes packed with stories that'll make your heart smile. Visit theappalachianchannel.com to pick up your copy today.
Anyway, the day of the county fair finally came, and the excitement was in the air at the Morgan County Fairgrounds. Since wagon tongues had spread the news that Jin Collins intended to compete for the prize awarded to the best and most graceful rider. Most of the contests of the week had been won by those sneaky city folks who bent and twisted the rules to favor them. But this was the last day of the fair, and the defeated mountain population anxiously but still hopefully awaited this final event. And what a day it was! A warm sun shone as a brisk breeze waved the flag flying from the judges' stand. A brass band thrilled the air with popular waltzes and marches of the day, as those judges, comprised of portly, red-faced, middle-aged gentlemen, sat below in cane-bottomed chairs, dangerously atilt on their hind legs. The rough wooden amphitheater was filled with the citizens of Wartburg and the rosy rural faces of the mountaineers, as the competitors for the blue ribbon and the brand new saddle were just now entering and were slowly making a tour of the circle around the judges' stand. One by one they came. For the most part, they were young men, prosperous looking, and clad according to the requirements of fashion which prevailed in this little town. Good riders they were undoubtedly, accustomed to the saddle almost from infancy and well mounted. Just then, the 11th rider, the long, lank frame of Jin Collins, mounted atop Squire Goodlet's best horse, made his way into the arena. The other horsemen received this ungainly addition to their party with polite composure, and the mountain folks remained silent too. But those city folks, they shouted and screamed with hilarity, and what they were laughing at, Jin Collins never knew. Anyways, Jink too made his usual circuit with his ill-fitting jean suit, his slouching old wool hat, and his long gaunt figure. But he sat on his spirited horse as if he were part of the steed, and held up his head with unwonted dignity, inspired perhaps by the stately attitude of the horse, which was the result from neither his training nor his compelling reins. A deeper sensation was in store for the spectators. Before Jin Collins' appearance, most of them had heard of his intention to compete, but the feeling was one of unmixed astonishment when entry number 12 rode into the arena, and on the part of the mountain folks, the surprise was supplemented by an intense indignation. You see, that 12th man was none other than Jacob Lawson. Now, he might have been a mountain boy, and you might imagine that the rural faction might ought to root for him, and notwithstanding the fact that Jacob was a notable rider too. But the audacity to run against Jin Collins, the Mountaineers' chosen champion, resulted in outraged cries. But there was no time for that, since the event was now underway, and the 12 riders were ordered at attention. The judges were exacting. The riders were ordered to gallop to the right, and around they went, and to the left. And there again was the spectacle of the swiftly circling equestrian figures. They were required to draw up in a line, and dismount, and then to mount, and then again to align. For those whose maneuvers proved inferior, they were dismissed at once, and the circle was soon reduced to 8. An exchange of horses was commanded, and once more the riding began, fast, then slow, left, then right. The mounting and the dismounting were repeated. The proficiency of the remaining candidates rendered them worthy of more difficult ordeals. They were required to snatch a hat from the ground while riding at full gallop. Pistols were loaded with blank cartridges and fired from behind the horses, and subsequently close to their quivering and snorting nostrils. And the criticism of the judge soon mowed the number of the riders down to 4. Of the 4 horsemen remaining, 2 of them were Jin Collins and Jacob Lawson. Short turns at full gallop were then prescribed. The horses were required to go backwards at various gaits. Bars were brought in, and the crowd enjoyed the exhibition of a standing leap at an ever-increasing height, and then a flying leap. A tumultuous symphony of thundering hooves erupted with the tossing manes and the defiant faces of both horse and rider. In the lightning-like moment of passing, obstructions were piled on the track for long jumps. And in one of the wildest leaps, a good rider was unhorsed and rolled to the ground, while his reluctant steed had balked at the last moment, scampered around and around the arena in a wild effort to find the door. This accident reduced the number of candidates down to 2 mountaineers, and that city slicker, Tip Hackett, the man whom Jacob had pronounced as a formidable rival. The circling about, the mountain and dismounting, the exchange of horses were several times repeated without any apparent winner, as the excitement rose to a fevered pitch. Now, the blue ribbon and that certificate laid between the 3 men. The townsfolk trembled at the very thought of that substantial award, of a brand new saddle and bridle, all decorated with a blue ribbon, and nobody wanted the secondary glory of a certificate and a red ribbon that might be given to the 2 losing mountaineers. It would only leave one crack rider of Morgan County, forever enshrined as a legend. While the Mountaineers feared Jink's defeat by Hackett, to them it would be even worse if he lost to Jacob Lawson. But I tell you right now, no one was prepared for what happens next. In the midst of the perplexing doubt, which tried the judges' minds, came the hour for dinner, so they decided to postpone until after lunch. So the competitors left the arena, and the spectators transferred their attention to jostling with one another for the concession stands. Everybody was feasting. Everybody but Jink's daughter, Cynthia Collins. The intense excitement of the day, the novel sights and sounds utterly undreamed of before in her former life, along with the abruptly struck chords of the new emotions that were suddenly set vibrating within her, they had dulled her appetite for the midday meal. And while the other members of the family retreated to the shade of that old elm tree, she wandered about the fairgrounds. By coincidence, or maybe by the natural force of gravitation, Jacob Lawson presently was walking slowly and apparently aimlessly around to where Cynthia was. He said nothing. However, when he was beside her, for a brief moment, she seemed entirely unconscious of his presence. Then, upon seeing the young rider, she decided to speak her mind as to his sudden participation in this rider's event.
Why, Jacob Lawson, I never dreamed you would come all the way from Windrock with the sole intention of competing against my father, just to try and beat him out of that saddle.
And after a slight silence, Jacob spoke up. Well, I told you the other day, when I asked you if you thought you were old enough to be thinking about getting married.
Is that right, Mr. Jacob Lawson? Well, you ought to know that my folks don't think much about you around our house. Paul is always jawing at you.
Upon hearing this revelation, Jacob spoke up. Well, he better not let me hear him if he wants to keep his bones inside his skin.
Don't you worry about that, Jacob. He don't even give a second thought about you. Why would he bother to even tell you?
Sensing his chance to make a move, Jacob continued on. Well, I'll tell you right now, there's plenty of ladies who care about me. And to that, Cynthia spoke promptly, with more veracity than ever.
You mean Becky Stiles? You ought to be ashamed of yourself, bragging about that red-headed, freckled-faced gal. I would never tell nobody that she thought about me. I tell you, there ain't more a low-down woman on Windrock Mountain than that red-headed cheat.
Oh, now, Cynthia, I like you better than Betty Stiles. Come on now. You know I like you better than any gal I've ever seen.
Well, you got a mighty curious way of showing it. I don't know who you think you're talking to.
Well, I don't know what you're talking about, Cynthia.
Well, it's just like I told you. You got a mighty curious way of showing it. Coming all the way down here, trying to beat my paw out of that saddle and bridle that he's done got his heart sot onto. Yeah, you got a mighty curious way.
A great perplexity was surging between Jacob's mind and heart. It seemed he would have to choose between love and ambition. After all, he felt that he was the assured victor in the competition, and he had seen that saddle and bridle, and to him, their material and workmanship seemed beyond expression, so elegant and substantial. Never again would he ever have the hope to otherwise own such a saddle. His eyes would never again rest upon it, unless it was in Jin Collins' possession. Besides, anyone who's ever loved a horse can appreciate a horseman's unending desire to give her the best that he can. And then there was the pride in his own riding. This was finally his chance to show everyone that he was the best rider in the county. Jacob finally spoke. If you'll marry me, I won't compete no more. I'll leave that blue ribbon and that saddle for your pa, or that Hackett fella. They can just fight it out.
Well, you're a dadgum fool, Jacob. Ain't I done told you how no count my folks think you are? Lord knows, I don't want all of them jawing at me, too.
Cynthia, what's to stop us from hitching up my mare to my uncle's wagon and you and me driving up to the crossroads and get Reverend Jones to marry us? We can get the license down at the courthouse before we start. And while your pa is here fooling around and riding in that ring, you and me will be getting married. But just then, the crowds could be heard in the distance as the riders were once more summoned to the arena, with one notable absence, that of Jacob Lawson. In the ensuing competition, it quickly became evident to the red-faced judges that they couldn't award the prize to their fellow townsmen. So they reluctantly awarded the blue ribbon and the new saddle to Jin Collins. As the wild shouts of joy burst from the mountain folk, for the second place rider, there was the embarrassment of a paper certificate, which was the equivalent of a participation award, which of course he refused to accept. Instead, he shook Jin Collins' hand and took the defeat like a real man. Yet, before Jin had cleared the building, he was somewhat impeded by the moving mass of humanity, and he encountered one of his neighbors, a listless mountaineer who spoke up. "Jin, do you know where that there gal of yourn is? That Cynthia? Do you know where she's headed? Her and that boy, Jacob Lawson, have done went down there to the courthouse and got a license to get spliced." "What? Where's my horse?" exclaimed Jin, quickly putting that new saddle to use. Down the red clay slopes of the outskirts of Wartburg, Jin thundered, with a train of horsemen at his heels. Moments later, they splashed through the Obed River, leaving silver spray showers in a foamy wake behind him. And now he was pressing hard up the steep ascent of the opposite bank, galloping ferociously along a level stretch of road, with the fences and the trees whirling by. Yet, by the time the old man reached the crossroads, Reverend Jones had hitched the bride and the groom a full hour ago. And that was the last Jin saw of Cynthia until 3 weeks later, when the mountain girl reappeared without a word of self-justification or an apology for her conduct. Instead, she went about helping her mother with the spinning and the weaving for her little brother's clothes. It took a while for old man Jinx, but he finally got over his daughter eloping, and though he'd be the last to admit it, he kinda took a liking to Jacob. And as for the folks on Windrock Mountain, well, they still talk about that day that Jin Collins won the blue ribbon in the saddle and lost his daughter down at the county fair.